Okay, let's kneel for prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for the Sabbath that's coming. We know, Lord, that you set this time aside as a day of rest to have fellowship with you. We know that there are some who are facing difficult times with the storm. We also hear that Bonnerdale may get this tropical storm. It's a warning there, and of course, tornadoes are the real danger with these types of storms, and of course, the flooding. So we just pray for them, that your angels can watch over them. We are thankful, Lord, for the care that you give us and your providences, and we are thankful for the time that we have to study together. So we invite your presence here this evening as we open your word together and as we seek to understand it. Be with each person, be with those even watching this video afterwards. We ask, Lord, that you can bless them. And we ask also, Lord, that you can be with all those people who have been studying for truth and looking for truth. And we ask that you can guide them and guide us into all truth. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, with you two guys, how much of the study on Ezekiel have you seen?
I'd say about 4 of them so far.
4. So the 4 of them, all of them. Or
yeah.
5, I guess. There's 5. So you've seen so most of them. Now, so I'm just going to do a little bit of a review, and I'm going to deal with some things that I've been reading that are sort of attached to it, and just clarify a few points. And that's sort of my plan for this evening, and then to answer questions. So if you do have questions, feel free to ask them. And so I went through this with my wife. I explained it to her in a very simple way. But basically, we know that Ezekiel is a priest, and we don't know how old he is, but we know that he references this 30 years. And in his first vision, he goes to Tel Aviv, and he experiences 7 days while in vision. And of course, we know that's not actually 7 days of time that is taken up. It's a symbol, and it's a symbol of consecration. So we know that he's then consecrated as a priest. We also know that he's carried in this vision by these cherubim that he sees. And these cherubim are a representation of the constellations in the sky, the 4 main constellations. And one of the things that Ellen White describes regarding Ezekiel is that this is this complexity on the surface, but there's perfect order. And we paralleled Ezekiel chapter 1 with Revelation chapter 4, and Ezekiel chapter 3 with Revelation chapter 5. And so we have the eating of this little book. And so what we see is something that we already understood about this message, is that we need to eat this little book, and we can see that we are Ezekiel. So that's one of the things that we see clearly, which we've understood for a long time, but we see it really clearly as we've spent time here, that Ezekiel is this priest and we are the priests as a symbol. This movement is symbolized by the priests. And the 30 years, of course, we already had marked from November 9th, 1989 to November 9th, 2019. But what we didn't recognize is that the 777 days, it begins and ends this period, and that's symbolic of the consecration of the priests. So when we look at our disappointment, one of the things we know about it is that it's in God's providence, and it's something that's connected to our consecration, because that July 18th prediction and the November 19th or November 9th that started the 777 days are both failed predictions as far as what we initially thought was going to occur. So we spent some time going through the description of how the tribes were laid out in Numbers chapter 2. And we looked at this idea of the zodiac. Now, one of the things we're very clear about is that the Bible is against astrology. You know, the idea of astrologer, somebody who makes predictions based upon what he sees in the sky. Now, of course, astrologers also do astronomy, even though they didn't fully understand how the planets and stars moved in relationship to the Earth. They were just looking at things from an earthbound perspective. But we know that they did measurements of the moon, and they became very accurate in making these predictions when the new moon was going to occur at the beginning of the year. And they also had an understanding regarding the equinox, which I really didn't deal with, and I want to deal with that. So they knew the length of the month, and they had some other calculations, and I want to deal with these because I think they're important. There's something that I've dealt with and I've understood for a while, but some of the things I didn't. Some of the things are new to me. But one of the things has to do with the start of the Jewish year. And a question was asked by somebody, you know, to explain the calendars. And so I'm going to do that in connection with Ezekiel. And so these are, you know, if you have questions, if you don't understand, then ask the question, because other people watching it may have those same questions. So I have this drawn up there. I'm going to erase it. So this was just what I had explained, what we had done at the end of our study of Ezekiel chapter 3. Now, we know that the year, and I'm going to draw the year as a circle. The year to the Jews occurred in a circle. And the way that they would look at it is they would look at this as the autumnal equinox. And of course, this would be the vernal equinox. So we usually call it the spring equinox and the fall equinox. And of course, you would have these solstices over here. So you would have, in going this way, you would have the winter solstice. And over here, you would have the summer solstice. Now, we don't really understand these things. You know, the common person doesn't really understand this so much. We kind of get this idea that somewhere around the 21st of March, you're going to have the vernal equinox, and then, you know, the 21st of June, you're going to have the summer solstice, and then the 21st of September, you're going to have the autumnal equinox, and then December 21st, you're going to have the winter solstice. And one is those aren't correct, you know, not exactly, and there's a reason why. But we just sort of have this generalization. Now we know that it drifts a little bit in relationship to our calendar, because our calendar drifts and has to be adjusted with a leap year. So I'm going to try to explain this. I don't know if I've ever really explained this to anyone like in person like this. I've put it in a paper. But we do know that the Jews called this the return of the year. And this they would call the head of the year. Now, in Hebrew, that's Yom Kippur, not Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, pardon me, and Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And then this is, the word here is Rosh, here the word return is Shuv. And so they have this word which means to turn or return. It's also the word repent is shuv, because it means to turn. And so we have these two ideas. So we know that this is the return of the year. So the head of the year is at the top, and then you come around down, and then you get to the return of the year, and then you're going to go through that cycle every year. Now, we know, of course, that they don't start the year on the vernal equinox every year. At least they don't start the month. So the first day of the first month is the first new moon after the vernal equinox. Now, there is a dispute whether the day of the vernal equinox can be a new moon. But we know that the first day of the first month doesn't occur before the spring equinox. But the other thing is to determine how the spring, when the equinox is. So when the vernal equinox occurs, we now have a very exact science. We can use mathematics, and we know the orbits of the planets, and we can figure exactly when the vernal equinox occurs. But they couldn't figure that out to the minute or to the hour. They would just know which day is the day of the vernal equinox. And I'm going to explain how they do that. Now the solstices, these are the time when the sun is the furthest. If you're in the northern hemisphere, it's when the sun is going to be the highest in the sky, right? So it's going to be rising and setting the farthest north, and here it's going to be rising and setting the farthest south. It's going to be the lowest in the sky. And you can see a thing, I don't know how many of you know what an analemma is, but an analemma, well, I guess I'll do it this way. If you get a camera and you set it up and you take a picture every day of the same part of the sky at the same time of day, so the same time of day would be, you could do it at basically any time, but it has to be a time when you see the sun in the sky. So you could do it at 10 o'clock in the morning. Obviously, you wouldn't want to do it at like 7 o'clock in the morning unless you live near the equator, because sometimes the sun's not up till after then, at least up here. So anyway, what you would do is you would take a picture, and you would find that the sun is going to go through this. If you had, you could even do it, once every week, you get 52 dots, but you'd get something like this. And you would find that you would have the sun in a different place in the sky every day, and it would move in this particular pattern. And this pattern it moves in, this top part is a bit smaller, so I didn't really do it very good, but the top part's a bit smaller, the bottom part's a bit bigger, at least up here in the northern hemisphere. And the center of this here is the equinoxes. This, of course, would be the winter solstice down here, and this would be the summer solstice up here. And so the equinox is not the point where these dots intersect, it's somewhere below that. And so, if you did something like this, what you could do is you could measure this, if you had something like this. Now, they did something similar. They had sundials, and they could measure the shadow, and they would notice this pattern of the way that the sundial shadow moves throughout the year. Now, we know that there's 23.5 degrees of tilt of the Earth. And from here to here, this would be 23.5 degrees. And this would also be 23.5 degrees of the sky. So if the sky has 360 degrees of arc in the sky, or not 360, 180. So there'd be 360 around the horizon. But if you look from horizon and you go up to the zenith and then to horizon, you're going to have 180 degrees. And we know then that this is 47 degrees altogether that you would have of arc of the sky that would be used out of the 180. So this is fairly big in the sky. It's taking up quite a bit of the sky. So these types of things, the ancients would notice them. Of course, they couldn't take a camera, but they could look at the shadow created by a gnomon on a sundial and how it goes on the ground. And they could discern this idea that there's this pattern. Now, of course, we know that the tilt of the earth exists. They wouldn't really know that, but we can see then that this fits in with the idea from solstice to equinox and from equinox to solstice. So these are just some of the things that people noticed in the sky. Now, in order to determine the equinox, we know that the pyramids at Giza, for instance, the north wall and the south walls, they line up at the equinox. So they built them in relationship to north. That is, when you have true north, the solar north, based upon the way the Earth rotates, you will have, at the time of the equinox, the shadow will run parallel. So if you had a stick, you would be able to see that the start when the sun rises and the start when and the end when the sun sets. So you'd have a stick here, and at the sunrise you'd see this shadow here. So I'm kind of drawing this. So you got this stick here in the ground, and you're going to have this shadow. And so in the morning, when the sun rises in the east, you would see the shadow, and you would see that the top of this shadow of this stick would move in a straight line. If you were at the equator, it'd go right straight through there. It doesn't matter where you are. It would always go straight through this post. So the shadow is in a straight line. Often what you'll get is let's say you had a fence and you had a railing. And even if this railing is not running north and south, you will see that the shadow melts in a particular way. So there's things about these shadows. So if this is running directly east and west, you're going to get this part where it's not going to melt. Everything else will melt. Like if it's in the spring, often you have melting. It's a bit hard to explain. But the point is they did it by observation. And they would know that when the vernal equinox happened, the day of it, but it might actually be the day after the vernal equinox had occurred. Let's say the vernal equinox actually occurred, the previous evening. Well, you wouldn't know until the next day that you now have the day of the equinox, because you would have to wait till the sun is in the sky and you'd have to watch the shadows. So their equinox is not exactly the same as our equinox. And we know then that this vernal equinox, in relationship to the zodiac has it's divided into 360 degrees, and each of the 12 signs of the zodiac take up 30 degrees. So 30 times 12 is 360. So there's 12 signs of the zodiac, or 12 constellations, and these constellations rise, and there's 30 degrees for each constellation. Now, when the vernal equinox occurs, there was two different ways in which they understood this. The vernal equinox would occur in relationship to these signs, either on the first day of Aries. So this is the ram. And if you read the pioneers' writing, they will talk about the new moon when the sun is in Aries, that marks the beginning of the year. So on the evening that you see the first visible crescent after the vernal equinox, you would then be able to determine that the next day would be the first day of the first month. Now, there was two different ways that this was done. Even in the time of the Greeks and the Romans, when they dealt with this constellation, some people would mark the first day of the vernal equinox as the first day of Aries. Now, that's how it's done now, at least when we look at, if you looked at a horoscope, it would tell you something like it's the 22nd or whatever. And they would sort of have it close to what they thought the vernal equinox was. Now, there was also this idea that the 8th day of, that the vernal equinox lay on the 8th day of the constellation. So this is because at different times, this constellation shifts. And so some people would look back to when it was sort of set up, I guess, with Aries as being the first day of the vernal equinox. The vernal equinox would be the first day of Aries. That's how you would determine it. But some people would look at what actually happens rather than what was determined. So as far as horoscopes, they don't continually shift that start. They just stick with what they started with. But we know that continually shifts over time. And there's a lot of details about that that I don't want to get into. But the point is that the first day of the first month happens when the sun is in Aries. And that means that when the sun is setting, that you're actually in the vernal equinox. The vernal equinox has occurred. And so the constellation of the Ram, or Aries, will be setting at the time, just starting to come in between the last one, whichever the last one is, before Aries. And that would start the beginning of the year. So this is not something that the average person thinks about, but in the past, people observed the sky and they would recognize these things. They would be able to look at the constellations, they would look at when the sun is setting, and they would know where they are within the year just by looking at the constellations. But we know that the Jews didn't just use the vernal equinox. That is, they weren't using the months, those 12 months of the zodiac, as their calendar. That is, they weren't determining their year based upon a solar year. They were determining it based upon a lunar solar year. That is, they used the vernal equinox to adjust so that they didn't keep having the year shifting earlier and earlier, which the Islamic calendar does. The Islamic calendar has 12 lunar months in a year. So with the Islamic calendar, their year is 354.37 days on average. So obviously, they have a leap year system that they use. So it's 354 days. And the biblical calendar is the same, except that it can vary more than the Islamic calendar. But it averages, because of the leap month, it averages out very similar to our calendar. So 365.242. So the biblical averages out to 365.242. We'll just put it as that. So very similar to ours. And depending how you look at it, it's actually even more accurate than our calendar. This would be actually the Gregorian calendar, which is not really the true tropical year or solar year. So it actually 1.98 or something, 24198. So anyway, it's a little more precise than this, but this is close enough. And we can see that obviously the Islamic calendar, which is just a lunar calendar, would be about 11 days different every year. It would get behind. So what the biblical calendar does, it has a 12-month year like this. Now that year can be 353 or 354, 355 days. But they also can add an extra month, which they do every second or third year. And they do that 7 times in a period of 19 years, which is called the Metonic cycle. Now they actually even do it more accurately than that. But that's what the modern rabbinic calendar does. They use this Metonic cycle. So I hope people are getting bored and going to sleep here. But in trying to understand these calendars, the point is we know that the biblical calendar adds this 13th month. And it does that so that the beginning of the year is always going to start after the spring equinox. So the first day of the first month is going to occur after the spring equinox has occurred. And of course, this is not the equinox that we have. This is because this is determined by observation, not by mathematics and measurement. They're not looking at the planet's orbits and determining exactly the time of the equinox. They just determine the day of the equinox. And so we know that the vernal equinox, it has to be the first visible crescent after the day of the vernal equinox has occurred. So when you have the day of the vernal equinox, and then you see the visible crescent that evening, if it's the first visible crescent, that would be the start of the year. Now, of course, you could have had the first visible crescent a couple of days before the vernal equinox, which would mean you would have had a 13th month. And of course, that can be spanning all kinds of time there. It's not going to always be right next to the first new moon. Sometimes it'll be 29 days after the vernal equinox, sometimes 15, sometimes 14, right? It can be all these different numbers of days that you actually see the first visible crescent. So, we can see here that there's some, this relationship that we have of the year, which is really the zodiacal year. Because if we could put the signs of the zodiac on here, and we would see that they would connect the vernal equinox with the zodiac, they would connect that with the first day of Aries, of the ram. And as they move through the year, they would then recognize all of the different signs as you're passing through them. But the actual months themselves they're connected to it, but they're not exactly the same as the constellations. So in our calendar, they're roughly 10 days off, but they could have made it if they had wanted to. They could have made just that the constellations determine the year. And that would have been a sidereal year, which is slightly different than a tropical year. So it would be slightly different year that we would have if we did that. So I'm not going to go into the details of that. But we do know there's this thing called precession. And we talked about the fact that the Earth tilts, 23.5 degrees. So you have this axis, and it obviously goes straighter through it than that. But based on here, you got this 23.5 degrees. And you probably can't see that too well. But, yeah, anyways, you can see it enough. Here, maybe I'll move this down. So you got this Earth, and we know okay, I'll just do it this way. And you got, obviously, this is the solar plane, so that the sun is over here. And so you're always going to have half the Earth in shadow and half in light. And the distance between this would be 23.5 degrees of this tilt. I'll make it a bit more realistic. Right, so you have 23.5 degrees. And we all know that, that we have this tilt. And we know that when we have the equinoxes, this line of shadow lines up with the poles in respect to the sun. Of course, it's still going to be tilted, but it'll just be tilted at right angles to the sun. So, half the Earth will be in shadow based upon its rotation. So it'll rotate. Now, so that's at the equinoxes. Now they're measuring this, but they're not measuring it by looking at it from a distance. They're just measuring where they are on the ground, and they can determine that they have that equinox happening. So we have this precession that happens. So right now we know that the North Pole is going to point at Polaris, but over time, we have this movement, and it's every let me see, I've got to get this right. I might remember it wrong, but every 30 years it moves 1 degree, if I'm correct. So let me see if that's correct. I get this wrong sometimes. So we have 360 degrees. No, so it would, yes. So we would have 30 times. So it would move 70 it's going to move 72. So yeah, so they say 1 degree, 360. Let me see, I got to get this right. 25. Okay. So every 72 years, it moves 1 degree. That's how much precession you get. So to go through the whole cycle of precessions, that is, every year it's going to, every 72 years, that that line that it's drawing in the sky in this big circle is going just 1 degree. So it would take 360 degrees times 72. Oops. I'll draw this lower. 360 degrees times 72 years would equal 25,920 years. And this is called the Great Year. So this is the pattern or cycle of precession. And I mentioned this before, that if you look on Wikipedia or something, you know, they might say it's 26,000 years that this precession goes. And as far as getting this 100% accurate, the problem is that our year changes in length. So 72 years is, 25,000 years from now, a year is going to be a different length. It's going to be longer. So the years are getting slightly longer, not much, but slightly. And so based upon how the ancients understood and measured the sky, this is the number of years that they recognized the precession would occur. So this number here is a very significant number. Now, when the Jews, and we talked about this, when the Jews measure the length of a day, and they divide it into 25,920 helikim. I always forget how to spell it. Helikim. I think it's helikim, something like that. I've seen different spellings of it. Helic is 3.5 or 3 1/3 seconds long. So we make our day. We have an hour is 1,440 seconds, and then you would just multiply that by 25, and that's how many parts that we divide our day into. So it's, what is that? That's, I should just be able to do this in my head, but so a day we divide into a different length of time, 24 times 34,560 divisions in a day. No, I'm doing that wrong. That's what I'm doing. I got to multiply it by 60. Let me see. So that's, let me do this. 60 times 60 equals times. Okay, so that's how many seconds we have. That's what I wanted to know. How many seconds we have in a day. And in a day we have, we've multiplied this, if we multiply that by 3.33333333333, then we would get this number, 86,400. So that's how many seconds are in a day. But they divide their day into 25,920 helikim. So I know I'm going over this boring part here for a little bit. But we're going to talk about some of these things and some other things that are related. So the interesting thing is that we have their division of a day is this many divisions. And we also have this great year of the precession that is the same number. But of course, it's a much longer period of time. This is 3.5 seconds, and these or 3 1/3 seconds, and these are years, actual years, tropical years. So it's an extremely weird coincidence that you have this number of divisions of the Hebrew hour and this. Now, the way that they came up with the divisions of the Hebrew hour is the important part. And you'll see why I'm explaining this. It has to do with the length of the month. Now, they, of course, did not have decimals and zeros, the ancient Hebrews and the Babylonians. They used a base 60 numbering system, which was very difficult to do calculations. So they had to measure things. So they didn't really do this mathematically as much as we would, but they came up to how long a month was. And the way that they understood this was that if you had 25,920 months, and they call this the Molad epoch, or epoch, I guess it's pronounced, the Molad epoch, right? And that many months, and they determined that if you had this many months, it would equal 765,432 days plus 1 day. Now, this plus 1 day is actually, because of the fact that they don't have decimals, it's actually more precise than that. But this is, because it's actually like a 0.8 of a day, 0.812 or something. So they had this rough estimate. Well, this is so close that it's actually within a half a second difference than the modern calculation that we have for how long that period of time would be. So it's very, very precise. So in this period of time, you would have this many months would be this many days. And so if you wanted to know how long a month was, you would take this number of days and divide it by this number. And the month, when you work it out exactly, it's 29.530,587 days long. And that's a very precise number. It's very close to the modern amount, as I said, like within a half a second. Now, the way that they would sort of express this is it's 29 days and 12 hours. And if you're going to do it in minutes, it'd be 44 minutes and 2.8 seconds. Where the modern amount is a 2.23 or something. I can't remember the exact amount, the modern amount, but that's the amount. That's how long a month is. That's the average month. And so this is something very precise. And yet we know that the month can vary in length. And that's because the moon's orbit is elliptical. And it can actually vary from the shortest month to the longest month by as much as 13 hours difference. So obviously it would always be 29 days, but it might be 29 days and 6 hours, would be the shortest one. And then 30 days or 29 days and 18 hours would be the longest one, something like that. So it's, not going to have 13 hours shorter or longer than this. It's the average between that. So 6.5 hours shorter than this or 6.5 hours longer than this. So from the longest to the shortest, there's only 13 hours difference in the length of the month. Now, one of the things that I haven't really dealt with too much is this issue of 1844 and October 22nd, and why I have done the calendar the way that I have. So some people are in trying to address the issue of the calendar. We have an issue within Adventism, and that issue has to do with when was Jesus crucified. And we know that he was, I'm going to get rid of this. I'm not going to need this. Jesus was crucified in 31 AD on a Friday. And, we know that from the scriptures. of that it was a Friday. And most people will put it in either 30 AD or in 33 AD. And that's because when they're looking at the calendar that people are using is not the correct calendar. That is, they usually use the rabbinic calendar. And what they want to get is a Friday crucifixion. And the only way that they can do that is they can take these 2 years and put the crucifixion on Friday. But they don't take into account that the first new moon or the month always begins after the vernal equinox. So they pick these 2 years, but it's based upon a false assumption that the rabbinic calendar is correct. And we know that it's not. I've just read a paper, it's a new paper from one of the leading experts on chronology and the calendars. And he makes it very, very clear that there's no way you can have the years start before the vernal equinox. There's just no evidence for that. So we choose 31 AD, and of course that was Samuel Snow who picked this, and he put it in the midst of the week. And this has created an area that we're, as Seventh-day Adventists, that we're open, that we're vulnerable. That is, we have a position that no one else has, that Jesus was crucified in 31 AD. Of course, if you go on the internet, you'll find lots of people who say that he was crucified in 31 AD who aren't Seventh-day Adventists. But the only reason they say that is because they read Seventh-day Adventist material and they just accepted that date based upon that happened to be the date that they picked. So they didn't really know what they were doing. Many people who support 31 AD actually have no idea the arguments of how we came to that. So they don't know that Adventists are the ones who created this date, and that we have a reason why we do this, and we have a logic behind this. Now in 31 AD, in order to get a Friday crucifixion, and I'm going to show you here I'm going to bring this up here, this program, Skyview Cafe. So I'm going to share it, share my screen, and so this isn't the most exciting thing in the world, but it is an important point for Seventh-day Adventists. Now I'm going to put this to 31 AD right now. I have it on 70 AD. And I'm going to go to the month of April. And I'm going to blow this up so you can see it a little bit better. I can't do it. I have to go this way. It doesn't really help. Yeah, this one doesn't work good when I try to change the size. So you're not going to be able to see all the little numbers, but you should be able to see enough here. Now, we can see in April of 31 AD, you have, on the 10th day of April, you have what is called the conjunction. And that conjunction is when the moon is between the earth and the sun. It's the time when it's exactly between. Now, it may not be perfectly in line, but if it is, you will get an eclipse on the surface of the earth. But sometimes it might be slightly above or below, but it will definitely be between. And so that time of conjunction is what we often call the new moon. But of course, that's not the new moon as understood by the ancients, by the Babylonians or the Jews. The new moon for them was something they had to see at sunset. And so this is actually, you can't see the moon at all, because when the sun is setting, the moon is actually with it when it's setting at conjunction. So you would have to wait for the next day or the next day after that, and sometimes even the next day after that, to see the new moon. Now, I have this set up here right now at Boston, so I'm going to have to move this out of my way so I can see it. So I have it set at Boston. Now, the Millerites, when they determined in 1844, they determined their year, they used the Boston, not Jerusalem. So I'm just going to change this to Jerusalem. And when I do that, it's going to change the time. Now you didn't see that, but when I had it at Boston, it was something like 1 o'clock in the morning that the conjunction occurred. it was sometime in the morning, maybe 2 o'clock. I can't remember what time. Here, I could go back. I just want to see what the difference of time is. So when I went to Boston, it was, it's 6:30 in the morning. That's what time it is. And when I go to Jerusalem, the conjunction occurred at almost 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So that means that the difference in time between Jerusalem, and these are not standardized times, these are just local times. So that's why they're not like, normally if you have a time clock now, it's going to be the same minute, but a different hour. But these are localized time based upon noon being where the sun is at zenith. So if you're having basically 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that means it's ahead of Boston by, that would be 6.5 hours, I think, or 7.5 hours difference to go from 6:30 to 2 o'clock. So that's 7.5 hours difference. Now, so here you're going to have this conjunction. Now, the earliest that you could see the new moon, if you had good weather conditions, and that has to do with low humidity, so the air would need to be dry. Now, it might be possible too, depending on the anomaly of the moon, that is where the moon is in its orbit, it takes longer or shorter in the time to pass through the time when you can't see the new moon until when you can see it, or from conjunction to when you can see it. And that can be up to 3 days difference, 3.5 days of span of time. So it can be as much as sometimes the next day after conjunction, you can see the new moon. That's rare, depends, it'd have to be really early in that day. But sometimes it'll be 3 days afterwards. Now, what we take the position is that the first day of the first month in 31 AD was the 14th of April. So you can see the conjunctions way over here on the Tuesday. And you can see, if you look at it here, you can see on the 12th, you can actually see the visible crescent. I don't know how well you can see it on your computer, but there's enough crescent here that if you were out there on Thursday evening and you looked at the sky, you would see this visible crescent. And so you would have made the Friday the first day of the first month. Now, if that was the case, then the Passover would have been on a Thursday, and the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread would have been on the Friday. So we make the case that in 31 AD, that the month started later. That is, it didn't start on the day that you would expect. The first day of the first month was not Friday. The first day of the first month was Saturday, which would make the 14th day Friday. So Passover was on the 27th day of April. So this is a problem that Seventh-day Adventists have. And there was an Adventist scholar named Grace Amadon, and she worked this all out, and she went through the history books and tried to determine how we would know the calendar in the time of Christ in the first century. Now, one of the things I've noticed is that at different times, people kept the calendar differently. That is, we just assume that, there's this biblical calendar and it's always been the same. But people were influenced by the peoples around them on how to determine this. And obviously at the time of the Exodus, they had a way in which they observed the moon. Obviously when they're in Egypt, they're not in Jerusalem. If they were in Jerusalem, they might have determined the start of those days slightly differently, though it's, it would only be if it was very, very close. But also it would depend upon the conditions that you're observing it, the atmospheric conditions. So obviously if you have cloud, you might not see it. Or if you had high humidity, it would inhibit your ability to observe the visible crescent. Now, I have another website here which I use, and this is Torah.com, or TorahCalendar.com, pardon me. And if I go to 31 AD, and I'm bringing this up here in this context, in this study, and I'm going to go through it a little bit more in Ezekiel when we do the Ezekiel study itself. This isn't really the study on Ezekiel. And I'm going to go 31 AD. And if I go to the first month, this thing will give me, and this one I can blow up, so I'll make this a lot bigger. So what I did here is I put the first month in 31 AD, and then when you look at here, it will actually say Tuesday, March 13th. So the Torah calendar, they don't observe the start of the year correctly. That is, they don't wait for the first new moon after the spring equinox. They go a month earlier. And so in order to get this to be correct, I actually have to go in this program to the second month of the year, because that's going to be after the spring equinox. And when I go here and I look at this new moon, it's going to be, it'll say Wednesday, April 11th, that you can actually see the new moon. Now you'll see here, there's this line, you probably can't see this, but the new moon is just slightly above this line. Anything above this line, if the atmospheric conditions are good, you'd be able to see that new moon. And if it's, you know, on inside, there's a range in which it can be. Now, sometimes it will be quite high in the sky at the sighting of the new moon, and sometimes it'll be pretty low in the sky and very difficult to see. If it's below a certain angle, you would not be able to see it, partly because of atmospheric conditions, but just it's too close to the sun, right? So the further away it is from the sun, the easier it is to see. Now, so when you look at Wednesday, April 11th, that would even put the first day of the first month as a Thursday. And if you had that as a Thursday in 31 AD, you would then have a Wednesday crucifixion. And this is why there are some Adventists who argue for a Wednesday crucifixion, because what they do is they look at 31 AD and then they look at an astronomical program like this and they say, well, see, it's a Wednesday, because the first day of the first month is going to be a Thursday, so the 14th would be a Wednesday. And that's why they make that argument. And before I became an Adventist, I was following Herbert W. Armstrong from the Worldwide Church of God. And that was the argument that they made for Wednesday crucifixion. Had to do with, it was in 31 AD, because they're kind of an offshoot of Adventism, but they used the Wednesday crucifixion. So for about 6 months or so, I believed in the Wednesday crucifixion. And I may have told you this before, that I've had all different kinds of opinions through the years on when Jesus was crucified and how the Passover was done and which day was the Passover and so forth. So I've held almost every possible position on this issue. So, you know, but as you work this out and you become a Seventh-day Adventist and you read Spirit of Prophecy, it's pretty clear that it's a Friday that Jesus is crucified, not a Wednesday. And the way that we explain this is that obviously the beginning of the year was delayed. And that can happen for a number of reasons. So one is, it could be how that they observe the visible crescent. So it could be that they don't see this visible crescent from where they make these observations because of the conditions. It also could be that they only look for the visible crescent on the 29th. And if it's been delayed a couple of months prior, you still have these normal kinds of months, but you can't have a month longer than 30 days and shorter than 29. So it has to be 30 or 29. And so sometimes you can get a string of 30-day months, though even if you could see the visible crescent on an evening before, you wouldn't make the next day the first day of the first month. So even if they could have seen it on the Wednesday or the Thursday, if that's not the 29th, then it doesn't really matter that you saw it because it's been delayed. And so you have to wait until the 29th to look for that first visible crescent. Grace Amadon brings another argument to the table. And the argument she makes is rather unique. That is, not everybody holds to this argument. But what she does is she looks at the full moon. Now, you'll see here in Jerusalem, if you could see this, It's on the 25th of April, but really the full moon, it shows here at 10:23 p.m. that you have this full moon. Now, when the Jews observe the full moon, they observe the full moon differently than we do. That is, we do it by calculating where the moon is. But actually the moon can appear full for longer. That is, you can't really tell that it's not full. It can actually appear full sometimes for 3 nights in a row, depending on the speed that it's traveling. So when the moon is in, when it's going around the Earth, the closest point is called the apogee, and the farthest is the perigee. And I always get them mixed up. So just don't trust me on that. But anyway, when it's closer, it's traveling faster. That's because it's an elliptical orbit. And when it's farther, it's traveling slower. So in 31 AD, the moon at this time is actually traveling slower. That is, it's far away from the Earth. It takes longer to move through its cycle, that part of its cycle, in 31 AD. So at the time around that it's full, it's in this, and I actually have a program that shows this. And this is the lunar perigee and apogee calendars, calculator. And all I have to do is bring this to 31 AD. And I'm going to blow this up so you can see it, because right now it's very tiny. So this is a calculator, and I just go calculate, and it will bring me to 31 AD. And one of the things you'll see is perigee is when it's the farthest away, so I was right this time, and apogee is when it's the closest. And it's actually the farthest away on April 27th. So that date that we have that Jesus is crucified, the moon is at its farthest distance in its orbit. So it's traveling slower. And so it takes time. That moon is full for a few days. So this is just a fact about what happened in 31 AD. It's hard to tell it from this program, but because they have these pictures of approximating what the full moons would look like. But you could see that at least for these 3 days, the 24th, the 25th, and the 26th, the moon appears full. But Grace Amidon makes the argument that in the time of Christ, so this isn't always, but in the time of Christ, the way that people determined the month was not based completely on the new moon alone. It also had to do with the full moon. And she makes the argument that the Passover always occurs the day after the moon appears to be full at sunset. And the day that that's going to happen is going to be the 26th. At sunset is the day that they would determine that the next day is the full moon, that the next day is the Passover. So it's sunset on the 26th. Now, of course, the problem that people have with this idea is that you would have to know at the beginning of the month that the moon has this anomaly, and you would have to know what you're going to see 2 weeks from now. And of course, they don't need complicated mathematics to figure this out. They just need to observe all of these. So they were able to predict when they're going to have this long full moon, and that they're going to have to add that extra day to the previous month. Now, they only do that if that previous month has 29 days, because if it has 30 days, it doesn't matter. You're not going to have 31 days. So the start of the year is not going to occur later. Now, I initially worked all these things out in painstaking work to figure them out. I had to go through and do all kinds of measurements and calculations, and I used some of these charts and data. But now we have this program that was created, the calendar converter. And in this calendar converter, most of the time, this is going to be correct. So if you go to this calendar converter and you go to 31 AD, and you go to, oops, I'm hitting the wrong computer. There we go. you go to 31 AD, and then we have to go to April, whoops. And then we're gonna go to the first day of the first month. And you'll see that the first day of the first month on the Julian calendar is gonna be April 14th, which is a Saturday. And then when you go to the Passover, which is the 14th, that's gonna be a Friday. So this calendar converter gives us the right date, but we adjusted the calendar converter to take that into account. That is, we actually have to manually go through and take this into account for this date, but we didn't do it for every date. So when we made this calendar converter, and I didn't really make it, I just suggested it be made and helped him a little bit. But when Troy made this, he adjusted this to be a Friday, April 27th, that it's Nisan 14. So you have to take into account how I had worked out that year. But we couldn't figure out a system where we could get the calculator to do that for every year that's like that. So, if you were using this as an argument, you're going to see that our calendar converter is quite a bit different. Now you can see the rabbinic date is the second month and the 16th day. So it's 2 days difference than ours. And then the Islamic calendar is on the 15th day of the 8th month on their calendar. So you can see, we're still more in line with the Islamic calendar, but we're still 1 day ahead of theirs, or, behind, however you look at it, I guess behind. So I had worked this all out, but there's a reason that I did this, and this is Grace Amadon had actually worked this out. So now I shouldn't say that I actually worked it out on my own, and she worked it out independently. And I hadn't read Grace Amadon's book until after I had figured this out, that it had to be April 27th and how this had to happen. Now, I used just delays of the month by atmospheric conditions. And so I worked out all the previous months before that and came to the conclusion that if Jesus is crucified on a Friday in 31 AD, I would have to account for this delay. And I did it by atmospheric conditions, but she did it by using the moon's anomaly. So a different method, but we came to the same answer. Now, in a sense, we reverse engineered this. Now, so we're Seventh-day Adventists, and we have this way of looking at 31 AD that no one else has. So we have this contradiction that exists. And this is something that we have to resolve as Seventh-day Adventists. You can't just take my word for it. You have to look at this. And I've struggled with this for, 35 years as a Seventh-day Adventist, longer than that. Trying to figure out how this calendar's worked, how we can support 31 AD for the crucifixion on a Friday. And that's why I held to different views. I used to believe that the 15th day was the Friday and the Passover was the day before. There's some people who take that view. And I also had a Wednesday crucifixion. So I had the 14th of Nisan being a Wednesday, a Thursday, and then a Friday. And so I've held all these different views. And now what I found, though, is once I understood this, I found a consistency and answers to other things. So these things all lined up in other ways. So once I figured out how the calendar worked, then a whole bunch of things fell into place. I also ended up, recognizing that a lot of things that I'd heard about the Babylonian calendar, that it was somehow this corrupt calendar, is actually pretty much the same as the biblical calendar. It can vary slightly, and there's a few different rules that it has, but basically it's a lunar solar calendar following pretty much the same rules. The first new moon after the spring equinox, and so there isn't a lot of differences between the biblical calendar and the rabbinic and the Babylonian, but the rabbinic calendar has a number of differences. Now, so the one thing that we're going to look at this again when I'm in Ezekiel, and we're going to be dealing with his literal days, and we're going to be dealing with this calendar. So I don't want to go to Ezekiel here at this point and to the issues there. But this was all worked out. Now, this calendar converter isn't always correct. right? So there are differences. One is the biblical calendar from the first day of the first month is the first month is always 30 days. The second month is always 29. And then it goes 30, 29, 30, 29, 30, 29. But the seventh month can end after 29 days or 30 days. And that is the same with the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th. Those are observed. That's because they're not part of the religious calendar. And so they're not as important. Now, the other thing about calendars that we have a problem with is that we know that as far as the calendar for the holidays, and I'm going to have to draw this diagram again. I knew I had it for a reason. So we're going to stop the sharing here. So remember, we had this diagram here of the year, and we had the vernal equinox down here, and we had the autumnal up here. Right, so you got this equinox. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't actually halfway. From the vernal equinox to the autumnal equinox is 180, depends how you count it, but 187 days. That is if I count this as the first day and I count this as the last day. Now, of course, if you double that, 187 plus 187, okay, but and that's ordinal. So I'm going to do it as a cardinal day. So you take 186, and if you added that together, you'd get 372 day year. So obviously, when you go from the autumnal equinox to the spring equinox, it's shorter. And now this period of time here, from the vernal to the autumnal, is the exact period of time from the first day of the first month to the 10th day of the 7th month. That is if you had the first day of the first month as your vernal equinox, you would have your autumnal equinox on the 10th day of the 7th month. That it's 186 days, 187 if you count the first day of the first month as one. So from the first day of the first month to the 10th day of the 7th month is 186 days, right? But this would be, we'll call it 187 because we're going to call this the first, and so it's the 187th day. But it's the same thing if I go from the vernal equinox to the autumnal, it's also going to be the 187th day. So this 10th day of the 7th month wasn't arbitrary on God's part. Now, this also points to this design. Now, we know 187 is a symbol of July 7th. So, we had all kinds of things in Millerite history that pointed to July 7th, to Samuel Snow's last letter. There's all kinds of things. But this idea here, this fact, is a pretty amazing fact. Now, when Moses gave this calendar to the Jews, he wouldn't have understood this. The Egyptians did not have that kind of understanding of the sky like the Babylonians did. The Babylonians had astrologers, the Egyptians didn't. They did observe the constellations, and they did have, obviously, these clocks, but they looked at the rising of Cyrus to start their year, or Sirius, whatever that star is called, and they also used the Nile. So there was this relationship between the Nile and a sidereal type year, a rising of a star. So it was very different from the Babylonian and the biblical calendar, so the calendar of the Jews. So this idea then is that there's something about that God is using this timepiece to mark his feasts, and there's something about this that we have to take into account. There's a purpose in this. Now, we know that God is against astrologers. That is, astrologers are predicting events. And the type of events that they're predicting are, is it going to be a good year? Is the king going to conquer lots of people? And they would look at any anomaly in that year in the sky as some kind of portent of something bad, usually, that they could warn the king about, so that he doesn't make a bad mistake, so he can avoid going to war, if the sky says that he's going to have, lose in a battle or something. So obviously that's wrong. But as far as a timepiece, the sky is given to us for signs and for seasons and for days and years, according to Genesis chapter 1. And when I started out here, I did a review, so some of you missed that, but I did a review of what we had studied in Ezekiel. And in Ezekiel, we had seen that these four creatures, a cherubim, are symbols of the zodiac, and that this is about the sky. So it's not about the zodiac for astronomical or astronomy. It's not for astrological purposes, but for astronomical purposes. It's for keeping time, keeping track of time, that the zodiac is referenced here. And Ezekiel is going to be dealing with these time prophecies. But we see that he's 30 years old, or 30 years is referenced, either one. So it's a symbol of a priest, because he's consecrated when he's 30 years old. And it's a 7-day period of consecration. And we saw in chapter 3, was verse 15, I think. Could have been verse 12. But anyway, we have this 7 days that he's in vision, that he sits there astonished. And that refers to his period of dedication. And so we've paralleled Ezekiel with this movement. And that 777 days in hours, that starts on November 9th, 1989, and ends December 21st, 1991 at the start. But we have the same thing 30 years later, the 777 days. And when he's carried to this location by these cherubim, because he can hear the sound of their wings rushing as he's carried. And we know that he doesn't go there in reality, it's just in vision, but still symbolically, these 7 days are important. So I know that's an explanation of the biblical calendar, which I'm not sure if anybody really wanted to go through that, because I know it's not the most interesting thing. But my point is that there's all this preciseness regarding the calendars. And I've taken all this into account in doing these calculations. And when we go into Ezekiel chapter 4 on Sunday morning, we're going to have to address these calendars again. We're going to actually have to address them as we go through. And my other point has to do with 1844. So when we go to 1844, we know that the Millerites didn't understand what calendar they were using. They thought they were using a Karaite calendar. So when we get to 1844, we have the first day of the first month we have is April 19th. So April 19th is the first day of the first month. Right, so if we just put this on a line here. And this was determined correctly, but with the wrong reasoning. That is, they believed that the Karaites always began their year 1 month later than the rabbis, and that's not the case. But it was the case in 1844 that the biblical calendar was 1 month later. And that is, if you go to what the Jews had as the first day of the first month, we'll call it the 13th day of the first month. The 13th day of the first month, or pardon me, the first day of the 13th month, so they're going to add an extra month, is March 21st. And if you look at this year here, this is actually before the Jews would recognize the spring equinox. So they have to add an extra month because this is too early. And this is very, very close, but it's just too early because you have to wait for the sighting of the first moon after the spring equinox. And they would have sighted that first new moon on the evening of March 20th. And so on March 20th, the equinox has not occurred yet. And so they have to add this 13th month. Now, the Millerites didn't understand that. They believed that it was the Karaites always started 1 month later. So they didn't really understand completely how this 13th month was added. They just thought the Karaites, and they're not even thinking about the number of the month. They just think the Karaites are always 1 year later. So they would have thought this was maybe the 12th month or something on the Karaite calendar if they had done it. But it's the 13th month. So they didn't really even understand this extra month thing. They just thought it was always just 1 month later. I'm not sure why, but that's the information they had. They didn't have the information we have. And so they had the wrong information, but got the right answer. So that was in God's providence. Because if they would have started it here, September 23rd would have been the 10th day of the 7th month. And sure, the rabbis and the Karaites kept September 23rd, 1844 as the 10th day of the 7th month. But it would have been wrong according to the biblical calendar. You would not have the year start here. You would need this extra month. And so this first day of the first month, we know then to get to October 22nd, 1844, that's obviously all 1844. That's going to be the 10th day of the 7th month. And this is the first day of the year, and this is the 187th day of the year. Now we also, just as a reminder, we have the 5th day of the 4th month, and this is actually halfway between, so maybe I should put it roughly halfway. It's exactly halfway in reality between the first day of the first month and the 10th day of the 7th month. And that was July 21st. And then we also have the first day of the 5th month, and that's August 15th. So once we knew how the biblical calendar worked, we could figure this out. So this message is based upon an understanding, it comes from Adventism, that we have this Friday crucifixion in 31 AD, and we have the 10th day of the 7th month is October 22nd, 1844. Now the problem that arises, and if you run into lunar Sabbatarians, so lunar Sabbatarians, they know about this problem. And actually this problem, the solution that they came to was to apply lunar Sabbaths to it. Now, lunar Sabbaths were invented in 1995 by a Pentecostal, had nothing to do with Adventism, but it was adopted by some Adventists as a solution to a problem. Of course, you create more problems when you have a bad solution like that that's not based on reality. So what they noticed is if you followed these rules that Grace Amidon used in 31 AD, that you would actually have to have April 20th as the first day of the first month, and that you wouldn't have May 2nd as the Passover, you would have to have May 3rd. So we know that in the first century, they had this rule, but it's not a biblical rule. It's just a rule of the way that they did it at that time. And we would say, well, why, if they did it wrong, then Jesus is crucified on the wrong day. And some people actually argue that the reason he had the Passover with his disciples on the evening before is that he was observing the correct Sabbath, but that the temple was observing the wrong Sabbath. So some people have this wrong Passover. Pardon me, that they're the wrong Passover. So that they had his Passover on the Thursday night, but that the rabbis and the priests and that had their Passover on the Friday night. There's this theory of these two Passovers. There's no evidence for that. Now the problem that we have is that we don't think like people then thought. That is, we think about a calendar as a very precise thing. We measure things exactly. But for them, it's not a precise thing. It's something that is actually determined by consensus. That is, if you want to know when the month is, you can't have a different month than the people around you. It doesn't make sense. You have to have the same month as the people around you. And how you determine that month is not something that's, it's not really as scientific as we would think. It's something that's, the rules changed over time based upon what they believed. And we could see that the rabbis ended up with a completely different way of figuring out the year. And they had no problem doing that. They didn't even feel that they were departing from what the Bible says. They just, over time, adopted the practices of the people around them, and it happens gradually. So it's not something that's very clear to people. So, and they just would have no problem with it. So if everybody around you is determining that the fifth, and here is the argument. The Romans, and most of us don't understand the Roman calendar, and I'm not going to have time to go through it, but the Romans didn't have a 7-day week. They actually didn't have a week at all. What they had was a month. And their month was based upon a solar year being divided into 12 months and somewhat arbitrary lengths of the months of being either 28, 29 on a leap year for February, and 31 for July and August, and 30 for different months. So you had this rule, but they didn't count they didn't count a week. They didn't have a week. They had a way of counting from the full moon, and they would count backwards from that. So, and they had a determination of how they determine the full moon would be slightly different than how the Jews would determine a full moon. So how you determine a full moon is changes at different periods of time of how you determine which is the day of the full moon. But the point is they would just count backwards, like the days to the full moon, and then the days away from it. Now, of course, when we deal with, that's the Julian calendar in 46 BC, it was introduced by Julius Caesar. But people didn't just use that calendar. There was lots of calendars, and they still used the Babylonian calendar, but they had different rules than the Babylonians had, slightly different rules. Most of them were the same, but they still looked at the month in the calendar in that way. That is, they would look at the full moon as being the center of that month, and how you determine that full moon is different. So, so at different times, they're following different rules, and it becomes really confusing. And when somebody tells you that it has to be this way based upon some piece of information that they have, you're going to find information that contradicts that. So you're going to have the rabbis disagreeing, you're going to have the Romans having a different view, the Greeks having a different view, and the Christians having a different view, really, on how to determine their calendars. Because it's not something that in people's minds is this fixed thing. It's something that, one is it's negotiated to some degree, depending where you live and how the people around you are observing that month. Now, a way that we could sort of look at it, we have a thing called standard time. But there was a time when everybody determined what the time was locally. That is, if you wanted to know what time it was, at noon you would set your watch. Because when the sun's at its zenith, then you know that that's noon. And you would set your watch every day. And, and obviously there'd be some place, the post office, the train station, different times, different places were this place where they would determine, and they would have a clock, might be the town hall would have a clock, and they would set this at noon every day. But yet, once they started doing train travel and somebody had set their watch, it became very, very confusing, because if you go to the next town, their noon is at a different time. And so trying to figure out your schedule for your trains was a real mess. And that's why they came up with standardized time, so they had time zones. But the point is, before that, people didn't really have a problem with the fact that, noon is different for different people. So if you traveled, you would have to adjust your watch. Now, of course, we sort of do that too when we go into a different time zone. But that could be quite different, like a minute different or 2 minutes difference or whatever. So it wasn't something that's exact, but now we think about it right down to the second. When I sign into work, it's, they're going to mark it right down to the second, when I sign in. So we have this exactness about time and about calendars and dates that they didn't have. And you might find that, if you were signing a contract, you might have a dispute about which day of the month it was. Like the other guy might think it's a different date of the month. Well, it doesn't really matter. You put a date there. It's agreed upon. We're going to agree upon it's this date. A court of law wouldn't then say, well, you signed it on the wrong day. You'd just say, well, that's the day we thought it was, so that type of thing. So there's these differences. And I think to be able to think like the Israelites is a little bit difficult for us because we didn't live in that time. But we have to put ourselves into that time. And we have to recognize that we have inspiration. We have the Bible. We have spirit of prophecy. And if Adventism is true, then all of these calendars and things work out. And that's what I found. Is as I started to use the assumptions that Adventism was true, I found that there was this consistency and that I could figure things out based upon these calendars. But if I followed the rules too strictly, that is, if I assumed certain types of rules always were in force, I would end up with contradictions. Or if I assumed the rabbinic calendar was correct, for instance, I'd have we wouldn't even be able to be here as Seventh-day Adventists. We wouldn't have 457 BC, and we wouldn't have the 31 AD crucifixion. None of these things would have worked out. So we're going to see in Ezekiel when we get there. So, this isn't a study on Ezekiel here. This is just preparation for it. But when we get into Ezekiel, what we will see is that the understanding of the calendar becomes extremely important, and that it connects us to our time, and it connects us to Millerite history. So any questions? I know I went on. I should have had more discussion. I know, and it's a lot of information, so I'm sure that people are just probably forgot everything I said. You remember a few little points here and there. But any questions?
Okay, one regarding Ezekiel 1, where he's talking about 30 years.
Yes.
What was the year that Josiah having his restored Passover?
That's 622, and he's in 592 BC. So this is July 21st, 592 BC. It's the 5th day of the 4th month. And this is the Passover, so this is going to be the 14th day of the 1st month in 622 that he has his Passover. And this is going to be the 18th year of Josiah, but it's going to start in the fall of 623, and it's going to go to so this is his 18th year, and it's going to go to the fall of 622. So when he's counting here the 30th year, he's counting the 30th year of the Jubilee cycle. And this is going to be the 49th year of the Jubilee cycle. And then the 50th year is going to begin in the fall, because the 50th is the first. And just in a simplified way, it's actually more complicated than that. But so when he says it's in the 30th year, he's referring back to this being a Jubilee cycle. And this obviously then is the 49th year of the Jubilee cycle. Right? That makes sense? So this is going to be the first. So in the fall of 622 to the fall of 621 is the first year of a Jubilee cycle. And if you count from 622, that's going to be the start of the first. So 592 is going to be the start of the 30th. And
So in other words, it's possible that he was commemorating both the 30th year of the Jubilee cycle and the 30th year from Josiah's restored feast.
right, because he's referencing Josiah. We can see that he references Josiah, but he does it in an indirect way, because he's not saying, I'm referring to Josiah's 30th, or to his Passover, and it's 30 years from there. But it is both. But we know it's also a Jubilee cycle. Now, when somebody looks at this, and they will say, well, this isn't the fall yet, so how is this the 30th? And that's where the problem comes, because it's understanding how this cycle works. That the actual count starts in the spring for the Jubilee cycle. It doesn't start in the fall. But the 50th year is actually half of the 49th year and half of the first year of the cycle. So it's kind of, I simplified it, but it's wrong. But It's just, you can see then that this is the Jubilee or this is the 50th. So actually, you would start in the spring. You would start your count. So this would actually be the 49th. Would start in the spring on the first day of the first month. But so you've got these overlapping cycles, and it becomes difficult to count that if you don't understand it fully. Yeah, so, the main point I think in asking that, in looking at this 30th year, is it's something that's based upon chronology. It ties us to Josiah, and it ties us to the symbols of the priest. And it's on the 5th day of the 4th month, which is midnight. It's July 21st, 592 BC. So it's the same Julian date as the 5th day of the 4th month is in 1844, and that's not a coincidence. Right? And I'm gonna have to. Yeah. So any more questions? So that was a good question. Hope my answer was good.
Very direct and very well stated.
Okay, thanks. Now, the question I think I want to ask you, people here, I mean, I know that not everybody understands this completely yet, but are people starting to get an understanding of the calendars that you wouldn't have had a year ago, or even a couple of months ago? Or is this still for people confusing? So I want everybody to sort of answer, but not all at once. Kelly, did you have something to say? You lit up in yellow. Okay, somebody else? I can't hear Kelly, so. Is this starting to make sense? Somebody say yes, or somebody say no.
For me, it is.
Okay, so it's starting to make sense. You can see it's involved. It's not something really, really simple. Are there people who are still really struggling with what I'm talking about as far as the calendar, the biblical calendar?
I think they get to know the calendar converter. Look at that quite often, and
Yeah.
you start to get familiar with.
Right. Yeah. So the calendar converter is helpful, but it doesn't give you an understanding of how to figure it out on your own. Like, I had to figure that out. Took me quite a while to really figure it out because all the different sources disagreed with each other. So, but that's all I really have to do. I wanted to go through that biblical calendar because I know there's people who asked me about it, and there's lots more information regarding the calendars. I'm reading right now. I think I should send everybody this paper. I don't agree with all the guy's conclusions. He has some different interpretations, but it's a really long paper. I mean, it's 400 pages or something like that. So it's not like a paper, it's a book. But I have a PDF of it. If anybody's interested, I should just send it to everybody and you start reading through it. It gives you lots of good background information, but and it's very modern scholarship and biblical scholarship. So, Kelly, did you have a comment? Because I keep hearing your phone. Okay, so we're gonna.
It's not my phone.
Well, it lights up.
Just mute me.
I can't actually. I can't mute a phone for some reason. Won't let me do. Well, maybe I can.
Yeah, you can.
How do I do this? See, it doesn't show your microphone. I'm not sure why it does it. Oh, yeah, it does. Okay, I can mute you. There we go. Sorry about that. I just couldn't figure that out. Okay. So anyway, we're going to close with prayer, and I thank everyone for participating. Dear Father in heaven, we know, Lord, that the Sabbath hours are coming close. Some of us are already in the Sabbath. And we just ask for your presence. We ask that the Sabbath can be a blessing, that we can be a witness to those that we have contact with. And we ask, Lord, that you can help us to understand your truth, to continue to study. We pray that you can bring us together again, whether it's a Friday night study again for some, or for the morning studies from Sunday to Thursday. We just ask, Lord, that you can help us to study, to understand, and to obey your voice. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.